Well, I actually joined the Marine Corps at 17. I signed into the early entry program, the DEP program. So whenever I graduated high school, I already knew what I was doing that next August. So I was actually sitting in my senior year in Spanish class, and when the World Trade Centers were hit. And I was sitting there in class, already being signed up, and I said, I know what the next 4 years of my life are going to be like. I reported to the Marines, Parris Island, South Carolina. That was 2002, August 19th of 2002. I remember that day very vividly. We spent a night in MEPS program. We took the long bus ride down, and I stood on those yellow footprints the 20th of August. I was a mortarman. I went to the Marine Corps in Infantry. 0341 was my specialty. I shot mortars pretty much the entire time I was in there. There was other times where we got moved over to machine gunners and things like that. My first combat deployment was Afghanistan, and I made that deployment in 04. Afghanistan was still early whenever I was there. It was early in the operations and things. You know, we had been over there for a short amount of time, but vehicle equipments and things like this, we rode mostly in high back Humvees, and we had built a box to hold our mortar rounds. Our mortar rounds are about like that, high explosive. You have red phosphorus, white phosphorus for things, and we actually built a box on the back of the Humvee to where we could put our rounds in and then sit on top of that box. And we would do our vehicle missions like that, riding around. In Iraq, my vehicle was hit 3 times by IEDs. So where I was fortunate in Afghanistan not to have an explosive explode on my vehicle, Iraq, I wasn't so fortunate in that aspect, but I wasn't injured during that, those explosions. I had one went off. I was actually looking out the driver window. I was at this time in Iraq. I was a corporal, E4. We were traveling the roads quite a lot. We were a mobile assault platoon. I was a part of a mobile assault platoon where I was the lead vehicle commander. I had a driver and had a turret gunner up top, which shot a 7.62 machine gun. I was looking out. We had a divot in the road, which looked suspicious. And I had my driver pull up, and we were looking with binos, the turret gunner and myself. We were looking. We didn't see anything suspicious except for the crater that was already right there next to the road. And so we decided to go on, and I was looking out the window to see if I'd see anything. And the next thing I remembered was I woke up on my driver's lap, and my gunner had taken some shrapnel and asphalt debris to the face, which there was a considerable amount of blood and things like that, coming down. So after I regained my bearings and found out what was going on, we pushed through, we assessed the situation, we got the gunner, which was Matthew Patton at the time. We got him, bandaged up and sent him on a med flight out to the air base. We finished out. We checked each other out, myself and the gunner. We checked each other out, made sure we were all good. And when we found out we weren't, injured at that time, we stayed and provided security until we can clear the area. I left in 06. The battalion that I was in, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, my contract was coming up to its end. My EAS, my end of active service date was coming. So I extended my contract with the Marine Corps for 3 months. They said that I could extend my contract and deploy to Iraq, or I could not extend my contract and go to another unit and get out on time. But I decided to extend my contract and go on to Iraq with the guys that I knew and had basically grew up with, from 18 to at that time 20, 21 years old. So we decided to stay with them and finish out the fight. At the time, I didn't pay it any mind. I felt like I was living the best of my teenage years. That those times from 18 to 22 years old are the best times of my life, and I wouldn't spend them any other way. giving them to this good country.
We went by ship from the southern part of England, I think Southampton, and across the channel, and landed, I think that was Cherbourg, and of course, close to the shore, we anchored offshore and went ashore in smaller landing craft, actually. We were transported. We did a lot of walking, but the long trips we were transported by truck.
The Red Ball Express?
Red Ball Express,
Okay.
right. And we actually, the first place that we went to was the Saar Valley, because they were, that was a very inactive part of the front lines between the Germans and the Allies. Oh yes, we went through both the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line. And
How about,
we actually started walking when we were trucked into the Bulge. We were unloaded in Bastogne, and from there we walked. Oh yes, snow was a real problem, and the cold weather. In fact, looking back, I can't imagine how I survived, because we did dig a lot of foxholes. I remember one particular foxhole that I dug. I dug it right next to a 2,000-pound bomb that had not exploded. And my buddies thought that was kind of a ridiculous thing to do, but it was actually, the ground was a little softer right around where the bomb had penetrated the ground, and it was easy digging to keep warm. I did manage to get a pair of galoshes, I guess you'd call them, and I used to wear those without any shoes, but I would wear as many pairs of socks, maybe 4 or 5, all the socks that I could muster. Many buddies actually ended up with frozen feet and frostbite and so forth. And I used to tell the story that there were 4 or 5 times over there when people laugh when I was the only one that they were firing at. And to give you an example, when we got to Koblenz was on the Rhine. There was a nice walkway along the river, and I had gotten hold of a bicycle, and I was riding along this path. The Germans were on, of course, one side of the Rhine. We were on the other side, and they started shooting at me with small arms. And the reason I knew that they were shooting at me, they were probably 3/4 of a mile away, and I could hear the bullets rip into the brick wall or building behind me when I was going along there. So I didn't stay around there too long when that happened. See, I was just a young kid, just out of high school when I was in the service, and this whole episode in the Army was just kind of interesting to me. I wasn't afraid, and we saw a lot of terrible things. But it really did, it was a new experience for me. And I did a lot of foolish things, like take this bicycle. I did a lot of things in trying to get a hold of the German Volkswagen, which we were able to use maybe for a few hours before it was taken away from us. I had a great time over there going across Germany, because mainly it was chasing the Germans, being the first one to do this or to do that or get into buildings. Like our company, 1st Battalion, was one of the first companies into Buchenwald, one of the famous concentration camps where they had the ovens and so forth, and we got to see piles and piles of bodies and bones, and that part of Jewish extermination. But mainly, I wasn't really interested in Buchenwald. I was more interested in 4 or 5 German warehouses that were also in the same village, because now that the village had been liberated, there were no more guards, and everybody could, especially all the foreigners, could ransack these warehouses and get what they wanted. I came away with a rabbit skin coat that I wore for quite a long time. I had that underneath my GI jacket, and it helped immensely to keep warm.
Boot camp, well, they fly you down, then they stick you on a bus at night. And you've probably been up a day or two before you get to boot camp. And you arrive there at night on a bus. And the drill instructors, now this is 1967, they come to meet you on the bus at night. And I can't really repeat what they say when they get on the bus, but the last person on this bus better be the first one off. They march you into a place called receiving after they take everything you own, stick you at attention. Your eyes are straight ahead, your thumbs are at your side, the seams, and you stand there. We stood there for 2 days at attention. Guys were falling over on the floor, and they would throw ammonia onto their nose to get them back up. Now, a lot of times in receiving, after 1 day, they pick you up, but my unit, it took 2 days for them to get us. So we're going without sleep probably for 3 days as soon as we got there. And you're in total shock. So, and then I went to infantry training school. There was no break whatsoever. You leave Parris Island, you go to infantry training school at Camp Lejeune. You go through that, then you get like a 30-day break, you can go home. Then I went to guerrilla warfare school at Camp Pendleton. I left there and took off, went to Okinawa, from Okinawa to Vietnam. So we spent the night there at Camp Evans. The next day we're going out into combat. So we'd only been there 2 days, well, not including arriving at Da Nang, but from where we're at now at Camp Evans, we've only been there 2 days. So we're going out in the mountains on patrol in the jungle, and nobody knows anything. We haven't been in any combat whatsoever. We're going up an old creek bed, and we get ambushed, and about the first 5 guys get killed. And this is like, we realized then, this is not television and this is no game. Guys are bleeding to death. Shot in the leg where you see a cowboy movie and you think, okay, they're in the leg. Hits that main artery, goes back up behind the growing. They can't pinch it off. He bleeds to death in like 2 minutes. So I lay down a field of fire trying to protect these guys while the corpsman gets in there. So it's a big blow up. Nobody knows what's going on. They have to call a medevac in to get these other guys out. That night we set a perimeter up, the 360. And of course, like I said, we don't know what's going on because we just got there. The hole beside me, you get your E-tool, you dig a hole, you get down in your hole. And you're in the middle of the jungle, you don't know what's going on. These guys have just been killed. And I didn't know what was going on. They came to us 2 days later and says, did anybody know any of these guys? They didn't even know their names because we just got there. I'm sure they found them out later, but they didn't even know who they were. But anyhow, we dig our holes, we get in our holes. We haven't been dug in, but I don't know, an hour or two, we hear this gigantic explosion beside us. The hole beside us. There's 3 guys in a hole. We don't know what had happened because it's night. You can't get out of the hole, run around because you could get shot by one of your own guys, so you stay put. Well, what had happened, we found out the next morning, is they were digging their hole and they were carrying their grenades wrong. When they bent over, the grenade fell out. They hit it with their entrenching tool and kills all 3 of them. So now they're all 3 dead. And I've just been there 2 days. There's probably 10 guys dead and wounded, and I'm thinking, this didn't go on too good. I don't know how long, you got to be here for 13 months and this is going on. And when we went, 1968, General Davis, I found this out later because Randy Brinkley, who was Colonel Brinkley, moved here too. And he was the one that ran Top Gun School, but he was Special Landing Force in Vietnam. So I find out 40, 50 years later that this general was out there, and I can remember word for word what he said. He said, we've got permission from the Commander-in-Chief, which is the President of the United States, to be the first unit into the militarized zone, because prior to that, you wasn't allowed in there. He said there's a North Vietnamese battalion caught, and they can't get back across the Ben Ha River. And he said, tomorrow, before the dust from the B-52s have hit the ground, we're going in fighting like Marines, and we're going to die like Marines, and we're not coming back till all them are dead or all us are dead. And I'd been there probably about 10 months then and seen quite a bit, and I'm going like, boy, this don't sound too good. Choppers pick us up the next morning. We get on choppers, and we're up for a while. When you're up for a while, you know that something's going on. It's like a hot LZ, which means they're there. We land and we hit their perimeter. After we get out of our chopper stuff, we hit their perimeter. There was probably, 5, 10 Marines killed out of my battalion and then wounded. But we ran all these North Vietnamese out of their holes. So we killed quite a few of them. We took over their holes. So we're out there for about an hour and we're setting up interlocking fire, which is machine guns, mortars. You interlock all your fires so there's no route they can get to you. So we set all that up, and I'm standing there trying to set up a 60 mortar, and an 81 mortar guy comes over to me, which is a bigger mortar, and wants to know where I'm hitting, so he'll hit a different place to cover everything. About then, we hear these bugles blowing, and we're going like, and we'd already had a platoon out checking outside our perimeter. Well, they come right past me. The radio man was killed, and a couple other guys were killed. They brought them back in. But the bugles started blowing, then the mortars and stuff started raining on top of us. So then you got to get your heads down. Then they started hitting us from all sides. So now, being, just a lance corporal, you don't know what's really going on. And the choppers were coming in, and the first sergeant was beside me, who ended up running home Marine Corps. And we fought for 2 days straight, laying them out, and then they got quite a few of us too. But when you set that perimeter up with 300 guys, you can't see the other side of the perimeter. I was Alpha Company, the other side of the perimeter was Delta Company. After the second day, and they said, make every round count. You're getting no help the forward air guy, which spotter planes fly around for the F-4s to drop 500-pound bombs and artillery. They were in on top of us so close we couldn't use artillery or aircraft anymore because they would have blown us up along with them. But after the second day, Crawford yells to everybody, make every round count. Nobody's coming to help us, and we're surrounded. So I find out, this is funny it's kind of funny, but from Colonel Brinkley, who ends up running Top Gun school, I find out they didn't drop us in an NVA battalion, which is 300. They dropped us as a reinforced division. You're almost talking 2,000 that surrounded us. So Crawford.
And how many did you have?
300, what was left of 300, because we were shot up pretty bad. But he said, nobody's coming to help us. It's fight to the death. So here comes this helicopter in at the last minute. And I said, well, he's full of crap. Here comes a chopper bringing Marines in. Well, about that time, an RPG hits the chopper and blows the whole tail section off of it. And it flips around and crashes. And it looks like a big praying mantis sitting there. It's dead. But anyhow, after the second day, I see these other Marines behind me. I said, well, here comes some more Marines, man. And they said, you don't get it. That's all that's left of Delta Company. Everybody's been shot and killed from the captain on down to a corporal. Pushed us back across the LZ, so you can forget about anything coming in. And I didn't realize how bad it was until, like I said, 50 years later. There was probably about 25 of us that still capable of fighting out of 300. But on the third day, we loaded bodies for hours and hours and wounded. Not all were killed and wounded. But there was only about 25 still capable of fighting. But we were getting the dead and wounded out. And there was a guy in with the dead, and we carried him in ponchos, not body bags. And I seen this smoke coming out of this poncho, and I was going like, what's this about? Because these guys are all dead, and the smoke's coming out. So I go over there and pull this poncho back. There's a Marine in there with his hand blown off, and somebody had lit him a cigarette. So then his intestines are coming out. So I take my jacket, put some water on it, put it on his side, and he says to me, he says, this will be my third Purple Heart. I'm getting out of here. And I'm going like, you got to be kidding me. So this guy's calling these choppers in. I don't know who this guy is. So I said, hey, you dumb SOB, get that chopper back here. You left him wounded and with the dead. So the guy calls the chopper back, and we got him out of there. I find out 50 years later, it's Major General Hopkins, and I didn't call him. I called him a few names back. And the way he remembered me, he said, you're that little son of a bitch with a big mouth. And I said, yeah, that's me. So that's how he remembered me getting them choppers back there.
I had 2 deployments to Sigonella, Sicily, and 1 to Keflavik, Iceland in the middle of the winter, which was kind of cool because as far as the Northern Lights, buddy, that was a great place to see those. So when I go on deployment, it was a pretty good deal being stationed at home because I left the wife with her family and friends and stuff like that, so it was not too terribly tough for her. So my next set of orders was a flight instructor in Pensacola, which you better know your limits real quick or the students' capabilities real quick because these guys can kill you. I taught beginner students for about 3 months and kind of wore me out. It was like, ah. But I asked and applied for it to get advanced training, so I did, and I got to where I was teaching formation flying like my beloved Blue Angels do, and I taught night flying. So when the guys come to me, they got 20, 30 hours in the airplane. What a great advantage to have. So that was my second duty station. My third duty station was back home in Jacksonville, Florida, on board the USS Saratoga as the anti-submarine warfare officer. Having flown P-3s, we had a pretty good background. But as far as my knowledge of what the Navy did before I got to the Saratoga, didn't know anything much. and I got to what Saratoga was, we worked with everybody. The goal of the Navy is to protect the carrier and its battle group. I had no appreciation of that until I was in ship's company. There, you've got to protect the carrier and the battle group via air. There's air support. There's an anti-air warfare officer. And then other boats, anti-surface warfare officers, protect the carrier as far as any other vessels are concerned. And then my job as anti-submarine warfare officer, anything underwater, I was responsible for any type of threats to protect the carrier. I had helicopters on board the carrier called H-3s, which would dip sonar if I had a close-in threat. Medium range threat was a S-3, which was a twin-engine turbofan jet that could project out to mid-range, and then their long-range anti-ASW was the P-3s, which I was very familiar with. But in addition to those air assets, there are ships in the battle group that are also ASW ships. They have small helicopters on back, plus they drop what we call a tail, in which case they could listen to things underwater too. So I had great authority back then. I could move ships in the battle group. I could task any type of airplane that I needed. And what amazes me about the Navy, they give you such great responsibility at such a young age.
But I went to Jacksonville, Florida, to boot camp, and the Coast Guard at that time was under the Navy. They had been given responsibility for the amphibious forces. Most of the people today don't really realize just exactly what that was. But the war that we fought was not on our own land. Consequently, we had to go and meet the enemy either in his territory or some territory that he had conquered. We started in, and this was really my first landing now. I'd been involved in a rescue and a few things like that, but here it was in the daylight, and I was going into the beach. I thought, gee, this is just like the movies. I mean, I'm watching Technicolor out here, and that's what it looked like. And we're going in. And then as we got closer, all of a sudden, mortar shells started coming out from the beach. And then machine gun fire, and then firing. And I could see the water dancing like that as it raked across our boat. And I forgot about the movies. I wasn't looking at it, I was in it. And I think that when they raked across the boat with a machine gun, I was on one of the machine guns. Now, I forgot to tell you this a moment ago. They didn't let us drive the boats in on this first landing. The executive officer says, you'll go in as the bowman on this one, and we'll give you your boats back after this, which they did. But I was on the machine gun. Well, there was really nothing to shoot at. As we got there and those bullets started coming across, all of a sudden I had this feeling. It was almost like a terrified feeling. I knew that I was hit. But I thought that, well, I can't be hit up here where it'd kill me. I must have been hit in the legs. And I started feeling my legs to see if I could feel blood. Well, that lasts maybe 30 seconds or whatever. And then all of a sudden you snap back to remembering that you've got a job to do and you should be doing it. Because if anybody doesn't do the job, everybody's in trouble. The guy that was supposed to lower the ramp when we went up to the beach, we went up there, he was supposed to lower the ramp, wasn't having any part of it. I saw him laying in the bottom of the boat. He wasn't hit, he just getting out of the way. So I jumped out of the gun pit and went down there and turned the crank and let the ramp drop so that the Marines could run out. The Marines ran out of the boat, and then I had a Jeep pulling a 37 millimeter behind it, and they drove it right up on the incline. Now, if you're going into the beach like that, there's always sort of an incline where the beach is. The firing was so hot at that point that they stopped the Jeep and they jumped into a crater, which is just off to the right a little bit. And they jumped down there for a minute, and I was watching it, and it was time to start bringing the ramp up. I had gone back to my gun. I had to jump down again and start cranking the ramp up. And I saw this one guy come out. He looked like he was 10 foot tall. He was a Marine. He came up out of that crater, and I could see him against the skyline there. And that's what he looked like, really, a 10-foot giant. He took a hand grenade, he threw it like that, and he waved those other guys. And so they all followed him out of the crater. And they left the Jeep there, but they went charging up over the hill. As they left, another mortar shell hit right in that crater. This was about 20 foot in front of me. So I cranked the ramp up, we got off the beach and went back. At Saipan, it was a completely different operation. We went in there, and the plan was that we would have a diversionary force at first, and I would be part of this. I had, for some reason, I seemed to get in the first wave on everything we did. So I had the colonel of the Marines and two of his intelligence people with their radio gear in my boat. We went through the process, and we were just about 5 miles off the beach here. So the Japanese could see us with high-powered telescopes. We actually pulled alongside the ship. The Marines would climb down 4 abreast on the cargo net. Well, when those 4 got to the bottom, another 4 started here, and these Marines would climb up. This went on till it looked like we were fill the boat up, and we had nothing in it. We were the diversionary force. We went in, the mortar shells did come, and over the radio, now we had an interpreter in my boat that was telling me this. He said, well, the Japanese have said right now that the Americans are making their landing. This was in the center of the island at Garapan, and the Americans are landing at Garapan. He was making this, and then they started throwing mortars out at us. And as we got in closer, and I don't really remember how close we got, I thought he was never going to say turn around. But finally, the colonel said, you know, we're far enough, turn around. And we did. When we did, the Japanese, you could almost hear them cheering over that radio. We have repelled the American invasion. We turned around and we went back to the ship. Okay, at the same time, the LSVLs had, on the southern end of the island, do you know what? They made smoke. Are you aware of that? All ships had this capability. They had generators that would generate a very toxic smoke, by the way. And that smoke, they had covered up the end of the island down there, and the real first waves hit down at the end of the island, which is about at least 6 miles away from us. And that was going on. So then the Japanese realized what was happening, and all these, they had already said that people are riding up here on bicycles just to get, you know, to Garapan.
Landed in Vietnam, and they open the doors and the aroma hits you. Sort of a wood smoke, filth, the river's running right close by. You know, it's just not something you're familiar with. And it's like, what? That's the first thing that hits you. And the next thing is shrapnel, because here comes the mortars. And, you know, and they're hustling you off, and, you know, and everybody's trying to duck down there, and they know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. They got us over what we call the Reppel Depot replacement unit. And everybody's under bunks, laying down under bunks with mattresses on us, because that was the only protection we had at the time. The next morning, I mean, and when I say a mortar attack, it wasn't an all-out, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 rounds maybe. And I don't even know where they fell. I mean, they weren't next to us, but next morning they start doing the processing, and you get paperwork, and they hand me paperwork that I'm going to the 1st Infantry Division. I said, wait a minute, all of what? We're all MPs. You're going to the 1st Infantry Division. I'm not an infantryman, even though that's what basic is. No, it's where you're going. And they handed me a bayonet. a bayonet for an M14, and said, "You've got guard, you and whatever this guy have guard duty tonight. You're going to be at the main gate." This was at Tonsonhood Airport. With a bayonet? What are we going to have, hand to hand? Well, if it comes to it, you know, and they're not pulling your leg. I mean, nobody was going to have an all-out frontal attack at the main gate of Tonsonhood. They'd never get there. But that was my weapon for the first night. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is worse than, this isn't like anything. I'm laughing now because it's sort of a funny incident. Nothing did happen, but it was terrifying then. You know, there's all sorts of things that would happen. There was a little bar across the street, restaurant from the gate. And one day this little, he ended up being a waif. He had no family. His mother and father had been killed. His family had disappeared. And he's 8 years old. And he's hanging around by our bunker. We're telling him to get out of here, get out of here. And we could hardly speak any Vietnamese, a few phrases. He learned to speak English from hanging around by our gate. At any rate, he would run over to that bar and get us, sodas or, they had some sort of shrimp dish or something and this egg thing that, I don't know, things they would bring us. We weren't supposed to have any foreigners or aliens or whatever, just Americans in this gate. He ended up living there. This was his house because we had a roof on it, and not that we protected him, but he ran all sorts of errands for us and silly little things. And that kid ended up telling, it wasn't me, but told one of our MPs that was down there about some incident that was going to happen later that night around the North Gate. So, of course, you get this, and it's a little kid telling you. How's he know anything? But you report it, Sure enough, we take some precautions, and we caught some infiltrators trying to come in through into the concertina wire. We had a no man's land of about 300 yards around the place, full of concertina wire, and all the vegetation down. They came in a helicopter and just with the Agent Orange, and just the whole area, and then you had no vegetation, so you could see no man's land. Fill it up with concertina wire, 3, 2, 1, and it's difficult to get through. But they'd come in and they'd lay down on the ground and they'd be cutting like this. And we had claymores out there, but if you didn't, the claymores we had were operated with a plunger. It wasn't one that was remotely operated. Well, it was remote because we were over here, but it was still with a plunger. You had to see them, and you'd see them up there. You'd see a hand turn up, and we had starlight scopes, and you'd see the hand come up, and it would turn the claymore around so that if you pushed the plunger, you were shooting yourself. At any rate, this little kid became, hey, this guy's got. He's got info, and we made sure that he stayed well. One of the times the unit was coming in, and they brought indigenous workers into the base, and they would polish your shoes. Not that any shoes were really polished, but polish your boots. The MPs we wore steel pots when we were out in the field, but when we were around base, we wore just the helmet liner. And we had them painted up real nice dark blue, and then we had a nice white stripe around, and with a red, the 1st Division symbol on each side, and then MP in the front, and then we took clear shoe polish and polished them up. We wore white lanyards, white gloves, white shoelaces on base. So we looked the part. This unit's coming in, they want to bring some of these indigenous workers in to do all this stuff, the KP, the barbers, and things like this. And when they're bringing the unit, the people out at night, they come back in, 20, 30 minutes later from their pickup point, and they've got a pile of people underneath the tarpaulins. It's like, you're supposed to be taking them home, not bringing them back. And you just giggling. It's a bunch of women. Oh, wait a minute. Well, no. You can't do this. Oh, please. There's no please involved. You cannot do this. What do you want? There's nothing you can get us. There's nothing you can do to allow this. You've got to be able to do, we had a lieutenant that was in charge of the military police at Fuloy, and their lieutenant from, I think it was a transportation company, got together, and I was carrying a shotgun and a 45, and we had an M60 on several of our Jeeps. Those were my two weapons, my two personal weapons. We had rifles, but I didn't have one. I preferred the shotgun. They bargained that they would get us, again, this is 1966. It wouldn't happen today. But in 1966, he said, we want M16s. Okay, how many do you want? Well, we've got 36 men here, 36, got a platoon of people. I want 36 of them. Okay. And you're gonna let us bring the ladies on? One night, just one night. And there better not be anybody beating anybody up, or, we don't want to hear any bad stories about this. Okay. A couple of days later, truck comes up. He didn't have 36. He's got 72 M16 rifles on it, into hard boxes with Cosmoline all over them. It's like, where the hell did you get these? From the docks down in Saigon. We don't want stolen weapons. Oh, they're not stolen. Here's the paperwork. They brought up their requisitioned weapons, which they just gave to us. Well, what about your guys? Well, they've already got theirs. Okay, fine. So we all have, now we have not one M16, we've got two. Oh, I've got one on this shoulder, one on this shoulder. I can shoot, like John Wayne here, boom, 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 boom. But again, they were requisitioned for that unit. They weren't stolen. It wasn't black market stuff. But it's like, how do you just get away with that? I think any one of us could probably tell you, day by day, I never felt so alive and so close to death. You're doing something that I felt was important, and you were alive. You had to be alive. You had to be totally aware, conscious of everything, every moment. And yet you were, not just me, anybody over there was or even still, was that close, that moment.
You find yourself looking at tents rather than barracks that you lived in before. And they were built by the Seabees before us, and that's partly what we did for the Marines. We would build hard frame tents. They were wooden frame, wooden sidewalls, but a tent cover. And that was just one of the things. We built chow halls for them. Big 40-foot long, 30-foot wide, and that was a place to eat. We also would build water tanks. A different group, we have what we call the Group 8 ratings. There's carpenters, plumbers, mechanics, engineers. We each had our own specific skills. But when you're needed to help, you go help whoever needs the help. So I learned a lot about electricity, plumbing, and of course passed on information about carpentry to the guys that, were helping. So it was an interesting experience in many ways. I learned to drive forklifts, deuce-and-a-half trucks to take the crew out to do the job somewhere away from the base, even though I didn't need a license or didn't have one, because over there, if you could do it, you could do it. And that's what had to be done. So I think the interesting part about it, as far as, if you want to call it interesting, was going through rainy season, monsoons. When folks talk about the rain here, it can rain for days and days and days over there. So this is just a drizzle. It's not quite the same, but that's something that you never forget. You get wet, your boots are soggy, you're wet to the bone. You're called upon to go drag rocks from the hillside to put into the road to keep that from washing away. So you had a human chain, person to person, rocks down the hill. I had to smoke my pipe upside down to keep it lit. Our base was pretty much self-sufficient. We had our own galley, chow hall, so to speak, and no Vietnamese. The interaction was when we would take our garbage to the garbage dump, the Vietnamese locals were there to take our garbage and take it home and eat it. And that was a sad state of affairs, but that's the way it was. Anything we threw away, they repurposed, they reused, which was okay until they started stealing. And it's all right when, certain things, but that got them in trouble. We learned a lot of certain slang terms, like the other vet mentioned. If they didn't like you, you number 10 GI, dinky dow, and a whole bunch of other things that don't always mean nice. There was an Army unit that pulled in one day and was looking for scrap wood. And we had a lot of scrap wood, and they loved it. And they asked me, would you like a souvenir? How about some ears? I did bring home a few souvenirs, punji steaks, a couple of Vietnamese helmets, a bloody flag. But that's how things got done. We traded different things with the different units. If they needed stuff, we could help them out. We did. And they were showing their gratitude by giving us things that we could use. On the weekends, a case of steaks would fall off at our front yard, so we would eat quite well.
In the infantry, in the Marine Corps, the infantry's job is to find, fix, and destroy the enemy. The recon is the finder. We were the finders. We would go out in small teams into enemy territory and look for the enemy. Try and find out where they are, where they were, how many of them there were, what unit they were, what equipment they had, and get back undetected so we could relay that information. That was our job. We would get a patrol report or a warning order, and my favorite would read something like this. We think that the headquarters for the 94th NVA Regiment is on top of this hill. You 5 guys go find out if they're there. And by the way, if you can happen to be able to capture a prisoner, bring him back with you. And so off we'd go. I was wounded on my 13th day in Vietnam. We walked into an immediate ambush in a swale between 2 hills. And I was very fortunate that day. Mentioned earlier, I liked being point because that made me feel like I had a little bit of control, and I knew I was careful. But I was point that morning as we were moving to what we call an observation point or post, an OP, and I stepped on a hornet's nest in the ground, and they swarmed out, and I got stung a bunch of times. And I was pretty groggy the rest of the day. We continued from there, moved up onto what we call the OP. We were OPing down along a road and a stream, or a river, small river, from up on the side of the mountain, trying to see if we could see anything going on down there, get any information on enemy units. We didn't really see anything of note there during that day. So we got ready to move out and move down into the swale on the side of that hill to set up our harbor site. And we had 2 teams with us. We were heavy that patrol, thank goodness. We had 2 full teams, and the gunny, our platoon sergeant, was in charge, and he told Staff Sergeant Flores for us to take the lead. So I started to move out, and I stopped, and I told Staff Sergeant Flores that, I'm still groggy. I'm seeing double. And so he stopped. He talked to the gunny. They switched the teams. So now we're in the back instead of the front. We go down that hill, walk into the immediate ambush. A man named Jack Wright, who I just saw in San Antonio 2 weeks ago, was the first man in. He got shot pretty hard. Got shot in the upper left buttocks, bullet lodged next to his spine. He was paralyzed for a good while. The gunny I mentioned, he got shot pretty hard. He got shot in the chest. Luckily for him, the bullet went around his rib cage instead of through him. And so he was hit pretty hard, but not as bad as it could have been. And I got hit with hand grenade fragments that day in my side and in my arm. But I was really lucky because I was wearing my Marine Corps soft cover. We had just gotten there. We didn't have jungle utilities or anything fancy. And 3 pieces of shrapnel went through my cover that was flat on my head. I had a lot of other shrapnel hit my magazine pouches, hit the magazines for my M14, put big dents in them. Practically tore my pack off my back, the shrapnel from the hand grenade. As soon as the ambush started, I took 3 or 4 steps to my right and went down into a small depression. There wasn't any real cover available. And I engaged where I thought some of the bad guys were. And I heard the hand grenade hit, and I was thinking, oh, shirt. But I never got to the shirt part. I just thought, oh, and the hand grenade went off and turned me over and blew me to my right. And so I was looking my rifle upside down. And so I rolled back into my little hole, or my little depression, and continued. I knew I'd been hit, but I didn't want to know, so I just closed it out of my mind. And didn't think about it again until a little bit later in the fight. We had pretty much suppressed the enemy, suppressed their fire, and had them on the run, I think. And one of the guys had gone down, Don Bidover had gone down to get Jack Wright, the guy I was just speaking about, and was bringing him up to where, he got up to about where I was, and he had crawled up there, and he said, John, can you take him? I'm done. And I said, yeah, put him on my back. So the corpsman, Doc Burwell, was with him, and he started pulling Jack up on my back, and he said, hey, Horst, you're hit. I said, I know, Doc, don't tell me about it. We'll figure that out later. And so from there, we got medevaced out to a forward Charlie Company, 3rd Medical Battalion, and which was only about 8,000 meters from us. I'm involved in the Wreaths Across America program, where we put wreaths on the graves at the national cemeteries at Christmas time. It's usually the second Saturday in December. We go over to the National Cemetery at Mountain Home and distribute wreaths to each of the graves. And part of their program is that if you say their names aloud, they will not be forgotten. So I'm going to try this. First Lieutenant Doug O'Donnell, Corporal Michael Scanlon, Lance Corporal Andy Marcotte, HM2 Mike Bodemer, Corporal Jim Mosier, Lance Corporal John Foley, Lance Corporal Mike Michelle, Corporal Steve Thompson, Sergeant Nick Natsky, Specialist 4th Class Bob Howard, First Lieutenant Dwight Rickman. Those are my closest friends who are forever young in my heart.